By the end of this video, you'll have a framework for something most bank anglers never develop, a way to evaluate every cast before you make it, not after. Not where to stand, not which lure to tie on. A way to read whether the cast you're about to make will actually reach the fish in a way that gives them a reason to eat it. Because the evidence points to something uncomfortable. Most of the time, a good cast fails from the bank. It isn't the spot, and it isn't the bait. It's a sequence of small mechanical decisions made before the lure ever hits the water. Decisions that determine whether the fish sees something that triggers a strike or something that triggers the opposite. The three things this video covers: how the angle you stand at changes the amount of time your lure spends in the strike zone before it exits the fish's range, how the height of your rod tip at the moment of release determines whether your lure lands as a natural object dropping into the water or as a disturbance that reads to a bass's sensory system as a threat, and what a follow that stops short of a full strike is actually communicating about the cast, not the bait. None of this requires different gear. It requires a different sequence. The reason bank anglers don't get this conversation is that most advice focuses on where to fish and what to throw. The gap in between, the mechanical execution of the delivery itself, gets treated like it's self-evident. It isn't, and the evidence for that is in how often the same spot, fished with the same bait, produces on one visit and goes completely cold the next. The spot didn't change. The bait didn't change. The delivery did. Here's what most people assume when a cast fails: the fish moved, or they're not feeding, or the bait's wrong. That assumption is not wrong in every case, but it skips over the more common reason, which is that the lure arrived in a way that already answered the fish's question before the retrieve even started. Bass are primarily sight feeders, confirmed by retinal research published in Current Zoology in 2019, which documented that largemouth bass possess cone cells maximally sensitive at 535 nanometers and 614 nanometers, corresponding to green and red wavelengths, the visual system of an active, daylight-adapted predator built to detect movement and contrast. They make fast decisions about what's food and what isn't. And the lateral line system, a series of sensory hair cells running along both sides of the body, extends that detection into the low-frequency range, picking up vibrations and pressure changes between 4 and 200 cycles per second, as documented by the Minimalist Fisherman's Review of Sensory Research. Water transmits sound 5 times more efficiently than air. That means the disturbance a lure makes entering the water reaches a bass before the lure is even visible. The first impression a fish gets of your presentation isn't visual, it's felt. So the cast that slams a crankbait flat onto the surface from a high overhead arc isn't just noisy. It's already told the fish something. Let's use a single piece of cover, a laydown tree on a flat bank, and build the layers of this problem outward from it. A laydown is the first thing most bank anglers see, and that's exactly the problem. Because the laydown itself isn't one piece of structure. It's a collection of micro-positions, each of which holds fish differently depending on time of day, sun angle, and wind direction. Research documented on Bass Resource in its Casting Accuracy Guide states that bass will move from the base of a structure early in the morning to suspended positions in the upper branches as light increases. Same tree, 2 completely different positions within hours. That means the angle of your cast to that laydown, where you're standing relative to the trunk, the branches, and the direction the wood lies in the water, determines whether your lure ever passes through the zone where the fish actually is. Most bank anglers walk up to a laydown and cast from wherever they happen to be standing, and that approach produces inconsistent results for reasons that have nothing to do with the bait. The first layer to read on any laydown is the position of the trunk relative to deeper water. A laydown that angles from shallow to deep gives fish a gradient. They can move up or down along that trunk without leaving cover. Bass using a laydown this way tend to hold along the outside of the deeper half, not packed against the bank end. A cast that drops right at the bank end of the trunk and retrieves toward you has already crossed behind the fish before the lure is 10 feet into its path. The fish never had a realistic window to eat it. A cast that targets the outer end of the trunk first, where the deeper branches are, puts the lure in front of fish that are positioned to see it, gives the retrieve a path that pulls away from the fish into open water, and triggers the instinctive response that comes from prey trying to escape. The difference between those two casts is not bait selection. It's reading the piece of cover as a structure with a direction, not just a target to land near. The second layer is the entry point of the cast itself. From the bank, you have an advantage that anglers in boats frequently lack. You can cast parallel to structure rather than perpendicular to it. PaddleRoundThePier.com's guide to bank fishing specifically identifies this as the single adjustment that most consistently increases strike rate, keeping the lure in productive water longer by running parallel to cover instead of pulling it away immediately. For a laydown, a parallel cast along the outside branch line means the lure is in the strike zone for the entire retrieve, not just the first 5 feet. A perpendicular cast from the bank puts the lure in the strike zone briefly and then pulls it into open water, covering distance but losing contact with the fish's position. Both casts look correct from the outside. One spends 3 times as long in the window where a strike is possible, but there's a layer before the retrieve even begins, and it's the one most bank anglers never think about. The third layer is the entry sound and surface disturbance. A cast that drives a lure straight down from a high arc delivers more impact energy to the surface than a cast that ends with the lure arriving at a low angle. The difference matters because that disturbance travels through water 5 times faster than it would in air, and bass can feel it. Research on the splashless cast, documented on Tom Rowland's podcast, identifies the mechanical sequence. A low sidearm angle at the start of the cast, rod tip raised to 12 o'clock during flight, and line feathered to decelerate the lure so it arrives with minimal surface impact. When the rod tip is raised during the lure's flight, it changes the trajectory angle. The lure enters the water at a shallower approach rather than plunging straight down. The result is a landing that reads to a bass's sensory system as an object settling into the water, not one exploding through the surface. For clear water, this matters considerably more than most bank anglers assume. In clear water, bass in the Bass Resource Guide are described as edgy in shallow conditions. They're positioned to flee at sudden disturbances before they engage. The cast that arrives loudly doesn't just fail to trigger a strike, it can clear the zone entirely. The fourth layer connects entry position to retrieve path. Specifically, whether the retrieve creates a clean path for the lure to move, or whether it immediately crosses through cover. This is where line angle becomes a variable most anglers overlook. When you cast to the outer end of a laydown from a position directly across from it, your retrieve path pulls the lure through the branch structure. The lure is snagging or deflecting through the wood instead of running alongside it. Moving your position 20 feet down the bank so that the retrieve path runs along the outside edge of the branches rather than through them eliminates that problem. The lure contacts the branches by design, deflects off them, and then continues on a clean path, which is exactly the kind of irregular movement that triggers reactive strikes. Adjusting cast angle by repositioning yourself before casting is a different skill than adjusting where the lure lands. It means reading the piece of cover from the side before deciding where to stand, which takes an extra 30 seconds and consistently produces better casts than walking straight to the nearest point on the bank and throwing. The fifth layer is retrieve speed relative to water temperature. Bass are cold-blooded. Their metabolism and activity level track directly with water temperature, documented in Bass Angler Magazine's breakdown of common beginner errors. A fast retrieve in 52-degree water asks a fish to chase something it isn't metabolically equipped to pursue. A retrieve slow enough for the lure to stay in the strike zone allows the fish time to commit to the strike. For a laydown in early spring, the outer branches closest to the most depth hold the most temperature-stable fish, and those fish need a lure that moves at a pace they can close on. The right entry, the right angle, and the wrong retrieve speed still produces no bite. All three layers have to be in the same conversation. Now here's what the development so far has framed as the problem: entry sound, cast angle, retrieve path, and retrieve speed. 4 variables. Improve one and get inconsistent results. Run all 4 in the wrong sequence, and the fish tells you what happened with a follow that stops short. A follow that stops short of a strike is not a rejection of the bait. It's a read. Bass tilting their head toward a lure and stopping is documented behavior. The IGFA's coverage of fish hearing research describes bass slowly approaching potential prey and tilting toward it to allow the lateral line to analyze the vibration while fixing both eyes on it for depth perception. The fish came. Something in the final few feet broke the commitment. The most common cause is a change in the lure's behavior that doesn't match the pattern that drew the fish in the first place. A crankbait deflecting off a branch and triggering a follow, then entering open water and running clean, looks like 2 different things to the fish. The deflection said, prey reacting to structure. The open water run said, nothing to react to. The fish followed the first signal and lost interest when the second one replaced it. That means the solution isn't to change the bait on the next cast. It's to repeat the contact, deflect off the same branch again, at the same point in the retrieve, and give the fish the same trigger that produced the follow. The cast that does this is not a longer cast or a harder cast. It's a cast placed at exactly the same angle as the previous one, with the retrieve timed so the lure contacts the same branch at roughly the same point in its path. That's a cast you can only make if you know where you were standing and what angle produced the follow in the first place, which means the real variable the follow is pointing at isn't the bait, the line, or the hook. It's the precision of your delivery, and whether you're tracking what each cast actually did, not just whether it produced a bite. If this is the kind of bank fishing content you want more of, practical, specific, no magic casts or guaranteed results, there's a video here that addresses exactly the next question. When a spot has been fished the right way and still hasn't produced, how do you know it's time to move versus time to adjust the delivery and stay? Subscribing is how you find it when it goes up. Cover beats first. Always the outer edge, then work inward. Entry angle second. The cast that arrives quietly and at a low trajectory gives the fish a reason to eat before the retrieve even starts. Retrieve path third. Your position on the bank determines the path, not the lure. Those 3 criteria in that sequence are worth more than